So let's go ahead and get started. We're running just a tad late. I wanted to thank everyone for taking time to come and join us for this meeting. My name is Susan, and I'm with the Rock Lake Improvement Association, or RLIA. Our presenter today is Frank Lothenberg. He is the engineering project manager for REA. He's kind of mentioned that to you before, and that's the firm that we hired to do the work. Now, in order to do this project, Rock Lake Improvement Association received funding from the Wisconsin DNR. We also received substantial support from the county with the Land Water Conservation Department, and that'd be Marissa over there, and I want to thank her for all the work she's done. We also received substantial support from, I hope I say this right, the DATCAP, so the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. And then the rest of the expenses for this project are going to be paid for by RLIA, and RLIA is funded completely by its membership. So thank you, members, for your support. I'm thinking this meeting should run about an hour, like 40 to 45 minutes for Frank's presentation, and then time for questions. And in his presentation, as you can see on the agenda, he's going to spend time reviewing the field work and their analysis on the bank stability. And then in addition to that, he'll share their recommendation, and they believe that if it is implemented, it will lead to reduced erosion, more functional and or useful land area for the landowners, as well as a reduction in the sediment and the nutrient load that's going into the channel, as well as Rock Lake. Then he'll go ahead and outline what additional steps need to be taken. Since there's a few more of us and we're kind of separated like this, if you've got questions, I'd like you to, I'll be passing out 3x5 cards. Go ahead and make a note of the slide number that you're on and then your question, and then we'll gather those all up and answer every question. And then if you have a follow-on question as the question's being asked, then just raise your hand and we'll get to those too. So that sound good? And then the last thing I wanted to remember is, and Frank had said this earlier, the full presentation, the recording of the presentation, the hard copy report that the landowners have here, and all the appendices will be available for everybody to take a look at our website, which is rocklake.org. It will be up by this weekend. Right now, the website is getting upgraded, so it's going to be at the weekend. It will be on the home page under announcements, and it will stay there for a couple weeks, and then we'll go under lake reports. All right, all yours.
Great. Thanks, Susan. That was awesome. That was a really good overview. We can go to the next slide, which is just another cover, because Susan made a really awesome cover, and I was like, well, this is who I am. So we can go, yep, here we are. This is the beginning of our field work this year. So on April 19th, the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, that Susan had said, wow, DATCAP is a long acronym, as well as Marissa from Jefferson County were out doing a survey of the area. And just to give a little background on what a survey is, essentially they say they use that fancy piece of equipment that the gentleman's holding there. And at the end of that rod, kind of by where his foot is, when he takes what's called a shot, it tells you exactly where he is with geospatial coordinates. So what he would do, and what he did do that day, was take shots across the section of the tributary. So he'd take one, 150 feet away, 125, 100, 75, 50, and then he'd probably take some closer shots as he's going down that bank there. And we're going to get into more how I use that information to create a design a little bit later, but I just wanted to give you that background. He's taking a survey, and what that means is he's essentially allowing us to have a 3D view of what the Earth looks like. Okay, and step two, let's go back to the last slide. On the right side of that, you can see that's the end of a hand boring auger. So on June 9th, Marissa again went out, this time with me, and we went through and took kind of some strategically placed hand borings. And what we do with that auger is we, using brute force, drill it down about 5 feet and log the soils. So there's a lot of details that go into that, but essentially the color, how wet it is, if it's sand, clay, or what we were mostly finding, which is a silty muck, as we were talking up here earlier. That's a particularly difficult soil class to deal with when it's wet. So that'll be important too. So now we can go to the next slide. And if you're a little farther away, this might be kind of hard to see, but essentially what we're looking at here in the left side, you can see the tributary, the bank is high on one side. It's about maybe 5 to 6 feet tall. And then on the other side, you have this thing called sloughing. So the word almost sounds like what you would think. That silt soil that we were talking about, when it's really wet, it doesn't hold itself up. And so that really wet soil on the one side is actually just straight up depositing into the bottom of the tributary. That's the photo on the left. The photo in the middle, you can just see a lot of down trees and just really steep banks. This is on the far west end of our proposed project area. So this would be essentially the farthest upstream limits. A similar view on the right there is on the Muir property. Pretty steep banks, lots of trees, and you can see some of them have fallen down. And when you have quick growing trees on the banks, when they fall down, what they actually do is this really vulnerable soil is now ripped up and exposed. And so a big rain event can take and wash all the soil particles off those roots down into the tributary. All right, next slide, great. This is a map that Marissa put together. It shows the property lines, as well as you can see each of those red stars is one of the soil borings. So we'll just talk through it real quick. On the far east, that's 1 and then 2. We're going to talk more about hand boring 1 and 2 later. In short, the first one is right on the bank of the tributary, and the other one is further off the bank in the woods a little bit on the Ustik property. You can see we kind of did a similar thing there with HB 3 and 4, and I'm just moving south and west now. And move further west, we're looking at the wetland soil, and then the last 2 are at the edge, the project edge of the property on the farthest west. That's HB 6 and HB 7. And the reason we took, well, maybe we can leave that for a question later. I want to have plenty of time for that. But there was a reason why we took each one of these soils samples where we did, and that was essentially to just evaluate, okay, how are we at the beginning of the transect? How are we at the end of the transect? How are we right up next to the stream? How are we farther away from the stream? How are we in a prairie? How are we in the forest? Just to get an idea of the different soil types in the first 5 feet. And as I said, it's mostly silt, but we did find some pockets of sand as well. All right, we can go to the next slide. Okay. Now we're going to just hit a few definitions. First off, the two-stage ditch is a design that converts, and essentially there's a very well-written report definition right there, but I'm just going to give it to you straight here. The two-stage ditch on the left side, you've got a shelf and then two steeper areas. And these diagrams make those areas look really steep, and perhaps you could design a two-stage with that steep of banks if it was clay, but because of it being a silty muck, it would not support really steep banks. So don't pay attention to how steep those banks are. This imagery here is just to help you understand the difference between two common design options, one being the two-stage ditch, where you have what's called a low flow channel. That's like, I heard last year it was a really dry year, so the water would have just stayed in the low flow channel the whole time. It would have never even gotten to what's described as the high flow channel. The high flow channel is like, okay, there was a big snow in April, and then it was 70, and then it rained, right? We're thinking lots of water moving through. The goal of the high flow channel is to still contain that, but essentially slow down the speed of all that water. And that's why you have that wider bank for the high flow events. And you can see the traditional or conventional or trapezoidal ditch, whichever you want to call it, they're all essentially just a half of a they're a trapezoid. So the low flow and the high flow go into the same channel. And because of that, there's no ability to slow down the higher flow events. And we'll talk more about how that speed reduction of the two-stage ditch is advantageous in a little bit. One other term that I wanted to define while we're talking about definitions is rip-rap. Rip-rap. It almost sounds like something that somebody made up if you haven't heard of it. But rip-rap is essentially large, well-graded rock that doesn't have much soil in it, or maybe no small granular soil particles. Just well-graded rock that's used in strategic places to essentially armor the soil from eroding. In this project, we'll talk a little bit about where we might, in a final design, where we would say, hey, we need to add riprap here because the water is going to be flowing too fast. It would erode the soil. And again, in silty soils, you might be more likely to have to use riprap. Okay. And if there's any questions on those definitions, we can come back to them at the end and talk more about what each one of those means. I'll also be talking about using those as a design, so maybe it'll make more sense as we apply it. Okay, so continuing down our timeline, on July 12th, I met with the landowners, and a few other folks were there. But lo and behold, there were, of course, some very good questions that come from that meeting. And I will talk about, these were the 6 that I had written down on a card. Someone gave me a card at the end of that. It might have been you, I'm not sure, which was really handy, just, okay, how are we going to answer these questions? Because it's a tough project, especially with that silty wetland soil. Okay, so what ongoing maintenance will be required, depending on what design, if we do nothing, what would have to happen? If we do a trapezoid ditch, what would have to happen? If we do a two-stage ditch, what would have to happen? What would the plantings look like? How will the properties be restored? Where will construction equipment access the project? What amount of area would the project include? And then lastly, the flooding design. And the flooding design is essentially, as everyone knows, right, sometimes it storms really intensely. So we usually measure storms, and how we design projects like this are for, let's say the low flow channel gets inundated or overtopped every 5 years, or maybe twice a year if we want more collection. But the high flow channel, we want to design that maybe for the 100-year or the 200-year 24-hour rain event. So we're talking, and I described this in the report, but it's about, I think it's 4.6 inches in 24 hours of rain, something like that, where that would still be within the banks. The way it is right now, I would guess that the banks are overtopped well before then. And, well, we'll get into a bunch of different pros and cons, but essentially when we're looking to design a trapezoid or a two-stage ditch, we would design it using a model that can calculate how much water is coming into the area for those different storms. So hydraulic modeling is usually done before the final project decision. So we did not design or implement those models at this point. But using our firm's background knowledge, we drafted a recommendation. So I guess that would be a next step. So number 6 would be a next step. We're going to hit 1 through 3 on the next slide. There we go. Cool. So what ongoing maintenance is required? Of the 3 different options, right? If you do nothing, then you can kind of continue to expect those banks to slough and erode, as we saw in the first few images. The area is a wetland, and it's mostly silty soils. Wet silt soils can't hold themselves up at a steeper than a 3.5 to 1 grade. And when I say 3.5 to 1, that's 3.5 feet horizontal for every 1 foot vertically, right? And so obviously, most of the photos we were looking at were steeper than that. Okay, they've got tree roots in them right now, so they're holding up. They'll hold up temporarily, but when silt settles, if it's wet, it's going to find a shallow grade, 3.5 to 1, roughly, give or take. And so if you do nothing, the wet soils will just kind of continue to erode. The stream morphology will continue to develop in a natural way, which could mean a lot of erosion in one event. It's a little, it's kind of hard to predict. That would be doing nothing. All right, and then, nope, let's go back to the last slide. Sorry, I'm going to spend a little time here. And then the two-stage design would require a few years of careful maintenance to develop those banks on the right side. It is one of the big advantages is that you have this flat shelf, right? So it's easier to move equipment through a flat area than a steep area. The other thing I would say, so looking at this, you've got the channelized flow. That would essentially be what the trapezoid design would look like during normal flow. So you can imagine that if there was a high flow event, it would probably overtop that bank and then just be in the floodplain. And then in the picture below it, that's during construction. And so at our landowner meeting, we had also talked about what will be done to ensure that during construction, there's not a bunch of runoff, and all the banks end up in the lake just during construction. Construction is usually done during late fall when root mass is high, and then it would be done swiftly. And not to give too much of a sneak peek, but essentially part of the final design would be to get an approved erosion control plan just for the construction period. So there'd be some other tactics in that to control erosion during construction. But just to give you an idea, that's left side is what this ditch looked like during construction. And then the right side is after 6 years. During literature review, the hardest parts, the greatest amount of labor to establishing a two-stage design is in the first 3 years. Pretty much you've got erosion control matting to hold the soil in place as your native perennial water-loving grass species are established. And I know you were talking earlier at the beginning, before we even started this meeting, about how hard it is to control weed events. So mowing would have to be part of the plan for the probably first 3 years. I think it would be a little easier than, if you look at the banks now, where they're like 2 to 1 or 1.5 to 1, they're really steep. You can only mow pretty much above the bank, right? But now with a 3.5 to 1 grade, you would mow above the bank, 3.5 to 1 in a reasonably dry area, which is like over 10 feet away from the low flow. And then you would mow 1 or 2 passes on the shelf, which is flat. As far as getting seed establishment, the final seed recommendation would be part of the final design, but it would definitely include erosion control matting to help stabilize things before the grass starts to grow. All right. So that's what maintenance would look like on the 3 different options. Channelized, oh, sorry, I'm still on that page. Just is such a pretty 3 photos. I just needed to look at it for a moment longer. Woody species, beyond those 3 years, cleaning up woody species from moving into the banks. As I mentioned earlier, if you have trees growing in there, the biggest issue with that is that when they fall, they rip up a lot of soil, and then that soil's gonna kind of ruin the design. I want to make sure I get to all 3 of those questions that I said I would here. All right, so we talked about plantings, maintenance, and then the properties, if restored, would look something like 6 years post. So we're thinking thick prairie grasses. Yeah, so that would be with our recommended design. Okay, we can go to the next slide now. All right, and question 4 was, well, this is all great, but if you're going to do this project in like a week's time, you're going to need to get some equipment in there. And so how are you going to get that equipment in there? And this question was hard because moving heavy equipment on silt soils is not particularly easy. It's wet. So the 2 routes that we found as viable options, one of them comes in off of the Muir property. It would take you'd take a right essentially right after that driveway. and then the tractor or the road would go bend around like that. And the reason it has to go at that angle is that's a hillside there, so you kind of have to navigate it carefully with that equipment. Similarly, the other alternate aspect to get it into the ditch area for construction, or the tributary, would be through the Anderson property on the west side. And while we were looking at that, we're like, okay, obviously we were already thinking about this northeast section of the tributary. And that's because when we were out there doing field work, we saw, wow, there's a lot of channelized erosion coming off of the Muir property, going into the tributary, and then also off of the Anderson property there. So kind of during our field work, we were thinking, if we're going to change the design of this ditch down here, we might want to try to figure out this channelized erosion that's entering from the north, right? Because the main flow of the tributary is from the south. So at that point, fairly recently, we talked to both the Andersons and I don't know if we've talked to Muir yet, but Susan, I know, and you're here. So we talked to you about potentially fixing that up, like working on that. And I think that as an access point could act as a huge advantage for land improvement, because right now it's just really deep eroding, channelized area that's pretty hard to navigate. I only had to navigate it once, and I think it would be hard to navigate every day or regularly. I didn't see any good trails through there. So I think just controlling those banks would be a good setup for the rest of our tributary. So that's the answer for contractor access. Those would be our two recommendations. And we can go, we're going to talk a little more about this slide here. So if you're looking at it on the screen, you might see those black vertical lines. There's one on the far west of the project area, and then there's 6 more beyond that. So each one of those is where we did a cross section, and so we used that topo that we had DATCAP go do at the beginning of the project, and we were able to look at how the current stream is, how the current tributary profile or cross section is, and then put a 2-stage and a trapezoidal design on top of that and see how it would connect with the existing ground. A few other things on this map. We can also answer the area of the project. So the green line of the area, 92,035 square feet, would be the final ditch design. The yellow line would be including room for the contractor's equipment. So that would be during construction. So the yellow line would be construction, and the green area would be the final ditch design. And just for our design to meet with existing ground, it has to be a little wider on the west side, about 90 feet, and then a little shallower on the northeast side, about 60 feet. And you may notice that our final cross section right there before it goes into the Miljala channel is not in the proposed project area. That was originally part of the project, but when we were out there evaluating, the land currently is acting kind of as a 2-stage design would. There's a smaller low flow channel where the water velocity is higher, So it's mostly sand on the bottom. And then there's some shallow shelves that are vegetated, and then there's another shelf, and then it's woods. So we can talk more about how the hand borings played out and how the topo played out in that area. But essentially, our current recommendation would be to meet the existing ground at cross-section F. G. All right, that cross-section at the southern side of the Oostdijk land. All right, now we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is what each one of those cross-sections look like. So remember, cross-section A was on the farthest west side, and then it just, as we go through the alphabet, we moved farther east. And if you're familiar with the area, it says the landowner of either side of the tributary there. So you can kind of envision how much it would change. Now, just to give you a little more understanding on each one of these cross sections, the existing cross section is in brown. So you can see, for example, at the very beginning, the south side is quite steep right now, and that's likely because of a lot of the water, the channelized water coming off of Muir and the Anderson property is doing what's called undercutting of the bank on the Shropshire side, and that's steepening that bank. So that's an indication of active erosion. It's also much steeper than a 3.5 to 1, which, as we talked about earlier, a wet silt soil, the bank won't be able to hold itself up. So as trees or vegetation dies or gets blown over, that soil is going to make its way, and it'll gradually shallow out the earth. Up next, we got the green line. The green line in these cross sections is a trapezoid or a conventional ditch design at a 3.5 to 1 slope. So that would be the slope that we would recommend using for this wet silt soil. And then the purple line, which you can see is about 90 feet wide in total, is the two-stage design. And that's our recommended design. It's got the shelves where the water would slow down during high flow events, and those shelves would be vegetated, and then it has an additional 3.5 to 1 slope to meet with the existing ground. And on this first page, we're going to get back to our term riprap. You can see we recommended using riprap along the toe, or where the slope meets the flat surface, on the north side, as well as on the north side of the high flow channel, as well as both sides of the low flow channel in this region, because similarly to past reports, there's just a lot of erosion happening here, which means there's a lot of water moving through vulnerable soils. So we recommend armoring those soils with some riprap. And then if we move farther, as we move farther east, the riprap becomes less necessary because the land is less steep and there's less of that channelized flow coming from the north. It's more sheet flow at that point. So we would evaluate how much riprap is necessary, but just using the topo and these designs, we stopped using riprap by the end of the Shropshire and Muir properties. And if you have a plan in front of you, you can see I spec'd out the distances on it. I see that it's a little hard to read on the screen, so we won't get too into that right now. Now we can go to the next slide. Okay, and this is us moving farther east, and you can see the Jefferson County and Britsky land. Still would recommend the easiest thing to notice about that cross-section is how steep the south side bank is in the existing topo. And essentially what that indicates is all that soil that's above that bank is wet and is going to slowly move into the tributary. Slowly, or depending on the rain event, it could move fast. It's just a very steep slope, so there's low odds that it'll still be there over time. And then as we move to cross-section E and we continue to move east, we can see that the channel actually starts to shallow out, and the existing ground starts to line up very similarly with our designed, our recommended design. And for that reason, we recommended not including, essentially ending construction at cross-section F and allowing the final stage of the ditch, cross-section G, which is nearly at Cedar Lane Road, to just stay intact, as it already has a low flow channel and a high flow channel on a different shelf. All right. So we can go to the next slide. And I feel like I've kind of been talking about this already as we've been going through the graphics, but just to spell it out in the presentation for somebody who's maybe just reading through this presentation on the internet. These are our recommendations, and I think that there is a lot of information out there that shows the short-term solution. You might think we should just do a trapezoid design because it takes up less area, and it's a little cheaper to install initially. But at Resource Engineering Associates, the person that I work for, Bob, always says, if we're going to do a project, we want to do it right. And the two-stage design, based on the literature of it being applied in other states in the Midwest as well, mostly around the Midwest, and after talking to some NRCS engineers who've installed them, this seems like a perfect opportunity to install that practice where you can slow the water down in that second stage and have a flat surface that you can control a little better versus having a long sloped surface. So there's a lot of advantages to that just for overall maintenance, as far as not having a long sloped surface. You have a shallow sloped surface, then a flat surface, and then the first stage is where the water is flowing, so you don't have to do as much maintenance in that area. We also recommend, as I just noted, shortening the project area on the eastern section and extending it on the northwest. And lastly, we recommend using riprap in the toe of the banks on the western region. Yeah, on the western region. Okay. I also did some calcs in the report, which, as Susan said, will be available online to pour through all the numbers regarding what the literature shows two-stage designs can do to reduce sediment load and phosphorus runoff. The report has some awesome links to other one-pagers that talk about the pros and cons for evaluating what projects a landowner might want to do. The Minnesota DNR put out a really good pros and cons to trapezoidal versus two-stage design that talks about costs, installation, and long-term benefits. So I'd highly recommend that for people sitting up here. And let's see, we got next slide. So that's my recommendations. If you have a question on them, you can put down that number slide and we can talk about it in a little bit. And lastly, we got the additional data and next steps. So as I mentioned, question number 6 at the landowner meeting was, how big a storm would this design hold? And because of the amount of hours it takes to create a model that's going to accurately tell you how big a storm this specific area would hold, that usually is included before the final design. So you have a concept plan, everybody agrees, yeah, this is a good concept plan, and then we go through the effort of putting together a model that's going to tell us, okay, if the existing land looks like this, the 200-year storm is 6 inches in 24 hours, and we want to make sure that it doesn't go over our outer banks. How does that outer bank have to look as far as volume of water? So that's an additional step. A maintenance plan. We discussed what is typically used for maintenance is the first 3 years, the shelf and the second stage need to be mowed and controlled for woody and noxious weed species. So a maintenance plan would have to be developed. And then, as we noted early on, most of the area is a DNR wetland. So in order to construct in a wetland, you have to have an approved stormwater and erosion control plan. So that's a next step. And then additional topo data or topographical data, that fancy piece of GPS equipment, would have to be done in the Anderson property, because at the beginning of this project, we didn't know that we would be like, oh, geez, we should really include this section in the project. So we would have to do a little more field work for that. And then last, but certainly not least, would be a construction-ready design plan and report that you could hand to a construction agent, and they would go ahead and implement it in late fall. Some ditch projects are also done in the winter, but I think late fall is ideal. And that's pretty much all I have. The last slide is just a slide of sources. As I said, I just know this page, but those bottom sources are really good for the overview of what a two-stage ditch looks like, and then also the economics and long-term downfalls and benefits of that system versus a trapezoidal ditch. Okay, I think that's all I had for you folks tonight, but we can open it up for questions now.
I'm just collecting for you.
Do you guys have some?
Alrighty. So here's some questions for you. Any here that you want to pass on?
All right, we're going to start with an easy one. Late fall, probably would be mid-November through mid-December. And I think a project of this size would probably take about a week. This is a blank card. That's an easy one, too.
Why don't you read the question out loud so that everybody can hear it, Frank?
Yes. The first one was what's considered late fall and how long would the project take? That's what I just talked about. As I said, some of these ditch projects, the construction does happen in the middle of winter, like January and February, but it's kind of depends when the contractor is ready and has their equipment and can get to it. And then also the ground being frozen is good. You kind of want that. From beginning to end, how long is the tributary? Is that on the map? Now, how long is the tributary versus how long is the project area are two different things, because the tributary goes farther than this project. Do you have a good answer for that? Offhand?
I think from Cedar Lane to the Anderson property, it's about 1,200 feet.
Yeah.
But then it runs the length of the Anderson property and then sort of hooks north, but doesn't make it all the way to Shorewood Hills. So it's probably around 2,000 or 2,200 feet, the total tributary from where the springs are at the headwaters down to Cedar Lane.
Yep, so that was probably just over 2,000 for the entire tributary, but for this project area, it is right around 1,400 feet, I believe. 1,200 to 1,400 feet, 1,200. I think it might be spec'd out in there. But I could also include that in this graph before it goes live this weekend, if that's really important. But it's about 1,200 feet, 1,200, 1,400 feet. Depends on if you go north or south at the end there, where the project might extend. That's probably like 150 feet north.
I would think the length of that would be important.
Okay. All right. How's the erosion going to affect these property owners' topography over time, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, and so on? Okay. So when we were talking about the different solutions, as I said, most of the soils in the area are a wet silt. So I think that this water system is going to find its way back towards a wetland or a very shallow wet area if it's not formed over time. So I guess that would be, if you really like wetlands, that could be a pro, but if you want to use it and have like a stable edge to it, then that's probably not a pro, because then you just have this really wet area that you don't have any control over. And then 2, can the property owners shore up the banks as they see fit, or does the DNR have to issue permits and approve design? Because it's a wetland, I believe the permits and the design needs to be approved.
It's also a navigable water as defined by the DNR, so they would need a permit if they were going to disturb anything below the ordinary high water mark.
Yeah. And so, did everyone hear that, or should I say that again? You'd need a permit because it's also marked as a navigable waterway by the DNR. So anything above the ordinary high water mark, below the ordinary high water mark, is regulated by the DNR. There you go. Thanks.
Like cutting trees?
Below the ordinary high water mark?
So above the ordinary high water mark is then into county zoning. So if you're within 75 feet of the shore, then you're into county permitting territory. The zoning department.
Yeah, removing trees. And that, I guess, if this project were to move forward, then that would be part of the maintenance plan. So then you'd go from like, can we cut trees to, oh, we gotta cut trees, or, you know.
That'd be part of the, I mean, if you had approval to do the process,
Yeah,
the first thing you'd have to do is remove the trees.
yeah, well, that would be part of the construction. The first swath of trees would be part of construction. They'd remove those. So you probably would not fall on the landowners. I would assume that would be part of the construction company. Would remove all those trees. And I have seen that, and it's really humbling, the machinery that they use to do that. It's like kind of cool if you like stuff. Well, I mean, if you like seeing like equipment like work in ways that you're like, wow, I can't believe that just happened. It's kind of insane. Yeah, so
That's another benefit to the frozen ground.
yeah, that's a big part of the construction time. Okay, yeah, it'd maybe be December or January then, but yeah, because it is silt soil, so it'll be, and it's wet, so maybe will take a little longer to freeze.
A couple comments. When the drainage ditch / tributary was built, Arthur Korth, David Korth's father, said, yeah, go ahead and build it, but I don't want any of it on my property. And if you look at the property line, the ditch itself is 5 to 8 feet off of my property. I say the same thing today. You can do whatever you want, but you're not taking 45 feet of my property. And the other thing is, I heard all these surveys, this has been going on for 20 years. Somebody determined that most of the sediment in Mahola Shores was sand.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the sand is down on the Olstead property. It's not up here. You know, so I mean, that's something to think about.
Well, sand that you can see, sand that,
Here, off of this hill is quite high. And the whole drummer is solid sand. I'm like 90 feet away from it. So, you can do what you want, but you're not doing it on my property, okay?
I would like to ask where you have this data that shows that all of the sand, not that I care about.
No, that was one of those other studies came up with that.
The university studies came up with the fact that what was in the other side of Cedar Lane, where the turbidity curtain is, was 60% sand.
so
In other words, what's flowing in there is 60% sand.
I guess.
I don't think it necessarily said it was either here or it was here.
Yeah,
But
but
what's over here is 60% sand.
It's not going through the mud.
What's that?
It's not going through the mud.
I think.
Well, what
sand
it's
is part of
showing that there's, what sand being in the channel tells us is that the vast majority of deposition in the channel is taking place during high flow events. Because you need that faster velocity during storm events to move those larger particles that far downstream. So there is some sand mixed upstream, and we see active erosion taking place. So we know that that's the source of it, and we know that what's depositing is from large storm events.
Didn't I just hear though that your samples and all the sand down here?
They're not gonna do anything now.
So there's a few distinctions as far as where the sand and the silt is. The silt is, you can see it from the surface on your property, but that doesn't mean there's not sand a foot down. I think HB6 is right near the beginning, right near the western end on the Shropshire property there. If you look at that boring, there's like a pocket of 6 inches of sand at like 2.5 feet or something like that. That's one distinction about where the sand is versus where the silt is. It's not just what you see on top. 2, there's sand stable on the bottom of the Ustic property versus the rest of it is silting in, and that's because silt is moving its way into the tributary and settling there because the water's moving slowly. And so that wet silt is what's going to create a kind of like a wetland, is going to over time slough the banks and create a wetland. So as erosion is happening, it's the thing that's on top in the waterway versus the tributary is a lot thinner, so it's a lot skinnier. The cross-sectional area is a lot smaller. And so when you move the same volume of water through a small cross-section, it speeds up and it can carry away silt, but it can't carry away sand as well in low flow events. So the difference is kind of multifaceted, low flow versus high flow. So 60% of it was sand. Probably the erosion in that time was during high flow events. 40% was still silt. I would assume they used mass, but
Another thing, I don't know how long ago it was, but we lived there. Sherwood Hills Road was changed. And they redid something there. And, you know, they moved stuff around and maybe a lot of that stuff happened then. Because
that area specifically, perhaps, yeah.
that's where I'm talking about. And that tire has been down there since then, when we did the road. Yeah, yeah. So that road coming over there has caused, when they changed Sherwood Hills Road.
Caused some erosion problems and,
So, yeah, it did, so, just saying.
yeah.
Dug the pond there, it's now over 10 feet deep. It was solid muck down to 8 foot deep there.
Huh.
So that's what we got there.
Yeah,
Straight top.
yeah.
We hit gravel and we hit clay first at about 10 feet.
Huh.
And then after the clay was gravel.
No saying.
So I'm just giving you my experience.
That's what's under there.
Okay, yeah.
I'm out of the plan. I'm not going for this 90-foot slot through there. If Britsky and Muir want to do it, that's their business. So I'm going back to the original thing that Arthur Corr said. You do whatever you want, just you're not doing it on my property.
Okay.
Okay?
All right. Yeah, any other questions from you guys before you leave? No? Okay.
Well, I would be concerned about the 6 years that it's gonna take to grow it, and it has to be mowed. You don't have that capability.
Yeah, I think maintenance plan could be potentially worked out with other entities. I mean,
When they built the whole short, the original contractor submitted a plan that called for a giant septic tank before it crossed the road down there.
huh.
Maybe that's a good plan. You could pump it every 3 years, just like I do my septic.
Oof. Okay.
I have a question.
Uh,
Are there geotextile fabrics involved,
yeah.
part of this?
Yeah, certainly. Geotextile fabrics would almost definitely have to be a part of the stormwater and erosion control plan.
And what kind of riprap would you be suggesting? Would we be looking at limestone, would we be looking at fieldstone, what would we be looking at?
That spec would be called out in the final design, and it would also, so it would be a stone that would meet the spec and then would be available in the area for a reasonable price. So I don't have a good answer for that right now.
All right, this is my last question. What kind of collaborative work will be needed to see this through to construction?
Well, I think you just clearly saw that working with the people who own the land would be probably the biggest collaboration that you would need to get this into construction.
Are there financial collaborations that need to happen here?
Yeah, I think, for example, they were talking about maintenance. If it's a good enough project, could you have a grant that covers maintenance for the first 3 years as that establishment, or that would be a potential collaboration. I think collaboration is probably key to this project at this point.
Is there any municipal collaboration that we could employ here?
That question is beyond me. I don't know if anyone else in the room has a comment about it.
Well, certainly we have township residents, county property, certainly a national or a state concern with our water body. Is there any other kind of collaboration we could expect or pursue at this point?
I think those would be the main entities that you just named off. See, I got one more card here that has, how does current forest cover impact grass establishment? If it's a dense forest, then it's going to have a whole different understory than grass. So that has an impact on it for sure. The other thing is what type of trees are growing there, and as I said, if it's a quick growing tree, the root system is not as good, then it's likely to fall down in that low plasticity silt, that wet silt, and that's just going to lead to greater erosion. Bearing capacity of soil for future mowing, that would definitely have to do with drainage and mowing during the driest parts and having that flat shelf. It's not a super high bearing capacity soil. It's just wet silt, as we've discussed. But during construction, they can do some compaction. That can only go so far, though. Volume estimate for material removal. Where does it go? That's a good question. The material can go to a lot of earthworks companies will stock material and drain it. This material is super wet and low plasticity silt. It could be taken by somebody with an area to drain it, and then it can be reused. The total amount would depend on the final ditch design, and if you did a trapezoid or a two-stage. For the two-stage, it would probably be, I don't have a calculated amount, so I guess I don't really have a good answer for you there. But that would be provided, cut and fill for certain areas would be provided in the final design. How did the water volume change during September 7-inch rain event? I wasn't out there and I don't have a photo, but I would guess that it was high flow. I mean, that's definitely a high flow event. I don't know if anybody went out and looked at it at that point, but I don't have a good answer for that either.
Steve Cole?
We were there. It was an amazing event. It rained, 7 inches.
How does that, I was curious how that did.
What-
Does it
It did
feel?
not cover, no.
It increased the flow, but it did not cover like it usually does when we have that. And when was the
End
last
of
time-
season, I guess. End of season too, yeah, versus spring.
Dry before that rain, but it was just.
In 2009, the flow was over the top of the culvert. In this situation, the 6-inch one that we had it rose it up a fair amount, but nothing close to that.
Okay. All right.
Can I ask a few?
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Ask a few questions? So, we don't have all the landowners on board, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're talking about bringing construction equipment over here over to your property, isn't that kind of I guess my question is, why couldn't we come in from my property?
Well, one of the biggest benefits of coming in from that side is that that area would ideally be part of the project and would be reshaped anyway. And your area is wooded and is already functioning as almost as a two-stage where that forest starts versus you have like a shelf. If you wanted to suggest that, like access to the ditch was the goal there, those were the two places that jumped out to me and my boss as viable options, and then they would work alongside the additional area. So we wouldn't have to cross through and disturb any area off of Cedar Lane that's already functioning well.